A terrible fate. The expulsion of Germans after World War I. The Germanic people have been settling all over Europe for hundreds of years prior to unification of the German Empire in 1871. For hundreds of years the Germans built up their own society and culture in the provinces of Königsberg, Männel-Danzig, Stettin, Breslau, Karlstad, and Eger in East Europe. Many Germanic tribes settled in what is known today as Poland. Many different German tribes settled all across Europe and began building cities and villages. Germans living in Prussian land east of Vistula built 83 cities and 1,400 villages and made it their homeland for 700 years. The German population grew to the millions in Europe, and following World War II this population will experience a Holocaust of its own with the German expulsion. The Holocaust is defined as a destruction or slaughter on a mass scale, especially by fire. But many refer to the Holocaust as the mass extermination of the Jews in Europe in the 1940s. World War II on the Eastern Front was very brutal compared to the Western Front. Both the German soldiers and the members of the Russian army fought against each other using their own methods and not obeying the rules of war. The Germans and the Soviets followed the rule of Inirama silent leges, which translates to the law is silent in war. The Soviet Union did not view the German population as people, and they felt that were obligated to kill at least one German each day. If each Russian did not kill a German each day, then they would refer to that day as a complete waste of time. The German civilians struggled during the war, but they become the subject to victimization when the Soviet army crossed the German border on October 19, 1944. Many Germans who witnessed the events first helped paint the picture of the scene that the Germans were experiencing. German doctor Heinrich Ambiger was one of few that survived the Russian attack and was able to speak of it. The Russian soldiers murdered the German civilians on their front yards and left their corpses to rot. Males were shot in the head on the spot, and the women and children were raped several times before being murdered. The Russian army did not view the Germans as people. On May 30, 1945, expulsion had begun in Czechoslovakia, and the Germans were forced to pack up their things and leave the country. The rules of expulsion differed depending on the city where they Germans were living. For example, the Germans being expelled in Brno were only allowed to pack one suitcase per person and were forced to be stripped of all jewelry and money. Other cities allowed the Germans to pack 2 suitcases, and they were given an hour to pack everything in it. The Germans people were being forced to pack up 1 to 2 suitcases of the things that they needed to survive, but only had an hour to do so. When their time had expired, the Czech soldiers came in and marched 30,000 Germans of all ages out of the country at gunpoint. When the Germans finally reached the Austrian-Czech border, they were denied entry of Austria and re-entry of Czechoslovakia. The Germans were forced to stay in a field which was turned into a camp. This relocation camp quickly became a concentration camp in which 100 German people each day, which added up to 25,000 men total. This death rate is nowhere near to how many Jewish people were killed by the Germans during the Jewish Holocaust, but there are many relatable sites that show another Holocaust. Dr. H. B. Adler, a Czechoslovak Jew, who survived the Jewish Holocaust, witnessed the expulsion and placement of the Germans in the camps. He compares the German expulsion to the Jewish Holocaust because just like the Jews, the Germans of all ages were forced to pack their bags and move to a camp. The only difference between them is that the Czechoslovaks are victimizing the Germans rather than the Germans are victimizing the Jews. These German relocation camps were dirty, overpacked, and filled with disease, lice, and bodies dying of starvation or just dead bodies in general. The German people had to fight for their survival during the war and for the years following the war. Each German family had a different way of surviving. When the Russians came into the German cities, the soldiers did not evacuate those cities, which caused many to become trapped and eventually killed. Some German civilians were able to flee the city, but a majority were unable to leave. Many testimony accounts from the German citizens illustrate how they survived the Russian invasion. In most cases, the way in which they survive is willpower and the want to survive. German female civilian survivor Marie Newman's story of survival involves following orders that were given to her by the Russian army, which included giving up all of her gold and money and being sexually assaulted by the Russians. In one case, after being raped multiple times and almost starving or freezing to death, she laid there on the ground hoping the Russians would leave her alone. This worked for the time being, but in some cases the Soviet army would still sexually assault bodies of almost dead or even dead corpses. When the Nazi military attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, the soldiers and civilians in the Soviet Union witnessed a new type of war. The Germans destroyed any structure that was in their way and eliminated any person in sight. The German army was in full control of the war in the east until they had lost the Battle of Stalingrad in early February of 1943. This began the pushback of the German soldiers by the Russians. The Russians had to watch their family members killed and their cities burned to the ground, which caused them to be fueled with revenge. Joseph Stalin would use propaganda to influence the German hatred upon the Russian soldiers and citizens. In one speech, Stalin says, "Revenge on behalf of our brothers, sisters, wives and children, mothers and fathers in Russia murdered by the fascists." Desires, page 50. After listening to how the Germans were evil and they needed to gain revenge, the Russians were being taught to feel and think that way. The Germans living in Czechoslovakia did not experience much victimization during the war. There was no German flight until the end of the war for the Germans in Czechoslovakia. In other countries, the citizens were forcing the Germans out of the country. The Czechoslovaks would become violent and attack the Germans in Prague. This rebellion was very inhumane towards the Germans because the attack was out of hate. The Czechoslovaks were chanting Smrt Nemcem, which translates to death to Germans. The people living in Czechoslovakia did not want to overthrow the Germans living in their country, but they wanted to eliminate the German population. No German was safe in Czechoslovakia at the time. Civilians were arrested, leaving some dead, while soldiers were tied up, dipped in gasoline and lit on fire. During war times, it is very easy for groups of people to become hateful towards the other nations due to national pride. The Czechoslovaks were forced to live under German occupation during the war, and it eventually forced them to hate the German people as a whole, not just the soldiers but the civilians and children as well. In more southern countries like Yugoslavia, where there was a majority of Danube Swabian civilians inhabitants. These Swabian civilians came from German ancestors but settled in the region hundreds of years ago and made this region their homeland. These citizens with German ancestors were forced to get up and leave the region. In the southern European region, states such as Yugoslavia, Romania and Hungary, over 1 million Swabians were expelled after having their citizenship was confiscated. It's one thing to tell people that they need to leave the country, but stripping them of their citizenship takes their identity away from them, which was intended to make the Swabians feel like they were nothing compared to the other Europeans. These Swabians faced the same fate as the Germans in eastern Poland and were placed in labor camps that included little food and forced labor. Following the expulsion of the Germans in Eastern Europe and the end of World War II, foreign powers leaders, such as Britain and the United States, helped the victims who were suffering, while others took this opportunity to exploit the Germans. For much of the time, the event of the German expulsion was not publicized, so not many people were aware of what was happening to the Germans. It can be quite difficult for people and nations to step in and help the ones in need when they are not aware of what is going on. Victor Gollancz was one of few who was able to publicize the expulsion through his books and articles. Gollancz's books Threatened Values and In Darkest Germany helped depict what the Germans were going through in their homeland. These pieces of writings help get the word out for people to start helping. After gaining support through his books and newspaper articles, Gollancz was able to launch campaigns, relief efforts for more food rations for the German people living in the camps. During the war times and the years following World War II, the Germans were viewed as the enemy by many European nations. This was the case for many Czechs, Poles, and Soviets, but in some cases there were people who helped aid the suffering Germans. Soviet Red Army Captain Ivan Pavlovich Petraeus was one of the few to aid the Germans in their time of need. Thousands of German women were to be deported to a Soviet labor camp where they would be worked to death. When Captain Petraeus came across these women, he let them escape as he continued on his missions. Just because a nation trains its citizens to hate and kill a specific group of people does not always mean that everyone in that nation will follow the orders to do so. The big three in the West, United States, Great Britain, and France, were more willing to help the Germans in their time of need using a number of different plans and organizations. The Western European countries were not as brutal to the Germans because the German military did not invade and take over their country. Smaller European countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were trained to hate the Germans, but the Western nations were not brought up this way. In some cases, the British would go out of their way in order to help the German civilians, especially the children. British nurses dedicated their work to helping the starving or dying orphans that had been created following many of the bombing attacks on the German cities. The bombings killed thousands, leaving many children, including babies, to be left to survive alone. Many of the children died of starvation, but when the British nurses started helping, they were able to save thousands. On June 7, 1947, George Marshall first spoke about the idea of the Marshall Plan at Harvard University. The plan would offer economic aid to all European states who requested help. The Marshall Plan mainly focused on helping Britain, France, and Italy, but it had helped out Germany tremendously. The plan gave Germany $1.4 billion to the country. With the help of this money, the economy was able to recover rapidly. This economic miracle helped Germany by integrating millions of expellees in the country. When evaluating the acts of perpetration of the Eastern European nations, much of their reasoning is based upon revenge. These Poles, Slovaks, and Soviets were living their regular lives, and the Germans invaded, took over, and changed their lives dramatically for the worse. For years, smaller, weaker countries such as Czechoslovakia and Poland were under control of the German army. During this time, the citizens, especially the members of the Jewish community, were victimized greatly through arrests and mass killings. Regular citizens in Nazi-controlled Europe were forced to watch their loved ones killed and even raped. Watching these events happen can train a person to hate a specific group of people. These civilians hated the Germans, and when the Soviet Red Army came in and was able to liberate these countries, the people could get their revenge on the Germans. The Czechoslovaks were treating the Germans exactly how the Germans treated the Jewish people. The Germans were publicly humiliated, beaten, and even killed. During the Nuremberg laws in Germany, the Jews had to follow strict laws, which included being forced to wear the Star of David to show that you were a Jew. In Czechoslovakia, the tables had turned, and the Czechs were doing the same thing to the Germans. The Germans were forced to follow strict laws in the country, which included being forced to wear a patch of an N on the front of your shirt. The N stands for Nemec, which translates to German in Czech. The ones who were the victims during the war were now the ones committing the victimization, and it was because of years of being held down. The Germans were constantly victimizing them, and they had grown to hate the Germans, and they were taking out their revenge on them. During the tail end of the war, many meetings took place between the Big Three in the West, in which they discussed what to do with Germany when they had won the war. The idea of expulsion was brought up as early as December 15, 1944 by Winston Churchill. In order to avoid any future trouble, relocation and expulsion was the only viable option. There was fear that with Poland's new borders, many problems would surface with Germans living in what would now be Poland. All members of the Allies agreed that the Eastern Germans must be relocated in an orderly and humane way. In hindsight, this sounds like a good idea, but when it came to action, orderly and humaneness were not present, and it is because the Allies were not the ones who were relocating the Germans. Forced labor and slavery of the German population had been discussed at the Yalta Conference in Malta in February 1945. Joseph Stalin wanted reparations in kind, which in other means slavery, in response to the Germans invading the Soviet Union. The forced labor would be used by prisoners in order to rebuild what had been destroyed by the Germans. At first, this labor was supposed to help rebuild the destruction, but quickly turned into concentration camps where many people had been killed due to starvation and overworking. In the minds of the Soviet Union, there was nothing wrong with what they were doing because they were the victims in this event, not the Germans. Alfred Maurice de Zayas's book A Terrible Revenge, The Ethnic Cleansing of East European Germans, does a great job of explaining the event of the German expulsion in Europe following World War II. I feel that the book is specifically meant to target the readers who view the Holocaust as one event, and that event is the extermination of Jews by the Germans. This book shows that if we want to understand what a Holocaust is, we cannot look at one single event, but other Holocausts as well. We cannot overlook this even because the extermination of the Jews was more publicized and documented. This event is just as important to European history as any other event. The expulsion of the German had significant impacts that we can still see today.